Hey guys, it's Miss Landry, and today we're going to learn about two very important theorists in the developmental psychology world, Jean Piaget and Lev Vygotsky. So let's just jump right in. Before we get started, even though this is all under the umbrella of developmental psychology, these are two theorists who looked at the cognition or the cognitive development of children. So let's just kind of review what cognition is. So it's not just thinking. It is also looking at how do we learn over time? How are our memories built? Like, how do we encode from short term to long term? Now, you have two different learning objectives in this video. We're only going to actually cover one in this video. So, the first one is compare and contrast Piaget and Vygotsky in terms of cognitive development. When it comes to autistic spectrum disorder, we're going to put that on a second video. So, let's jump right in with Jean Piaget. He is a Swiss psychologist. He really is well known in psychology. He had probably one of the most popular theories of development. And the key for his theory is that the child is the scientist, meaning this the child has to interact with their environment. That is absolutely key to Jean Piaget's theory. That interaction and the experimenting, that is how kids learn. Now, with that came his theory of schema development. And we've talked kind of briefly about schemas and in class, but this is a great place for us to kind of go into it in more detail. So, humans, we have these what we call schemas, which are ideas of how the world works, right? Like if I said to you, what does a basketball player look like? You have an idea, a schema of what a basketball player looks like. So you've built this over time. And what will happen as a child, as you're learning, is something won't fit your schema. And you hit something called disequilibrium, meaning your schema isn't working. So a child might think, animals are fuzzy and they have four legs. And then, so they think all dogs are that way. And then they see a hairless dog or let's say a cat. And someone tells them, no, that's not a dog, that's a cat. And so now they're in this disequilibrium because their schema doesn't fit what they thought the world was. They have to accommodate this new material, and they can do this in two ways. They can either expand their schema, making it larger, or create new schemas. Once they do that, they're back into equilibrium. They now have assimilated the knowledge, and that is kind of Jean Piaget's idea of how children learn. So let's take a look at his stages. There's four stages that you need to know. The first one, and when you're learning about this stuff, I don't want you to memorize the stage names. What I really want you to think about is think of a child at these ages and why is the stage called what it is. So the first stage is called sensory motor stage. You can't really see that because of the color. Sensory motor stage. So think of a child between the ages of 0 and 2 and what they do. They're always putting stuff in their mouths. They have to touch everything. They're making all kinds of noises. They're listening. So their senses are key, right? So they're exploring their world through their senses. And this helps them understand and build their schemas. Now, at the towards the end of this stage, there's something that occurs called object permanence. They attain it. So in this picture here, you see this little baby and it's looking at this cute little stuffed animal and it loves it. And oh, look at the baby. Well, if you put something in front of that stuffed animal, the child, if they have not attained object permanence, they don't think the object is there anymore. They think it's gone. So they don't look for it. They're not, trying to look around the thing. But as they get older, they start to realize, wait, it is still in there. And their visual acuity is set to try and keep looking for it. They also start to recognize themselves as agents of action, meaning like if I kick this ball, it's going to roll. So they're the ones creating the action. Those are two very important developmental stages that occur during Piaget's first stage, the sensory motor stage. The second stage is called pre-operational. And I want you to think of operations in terms of like math operations. That's kind of how I remember this. So this is ages 2 to 7. Their understanding of the world is very black and white. Okay. They can start to use symbolism. And so here's a picture of a kid, riding a broom, as you can see, and he or she is actually thinking about this as being a horse. So they're starting to look at symbols, and their imagination is starting to grow, but they are still very egocentric. And what that means, if you look at this picture, the little girl doesn't understand that you cannot see through her head. She thinks that you can see everything the way she sees it. And so that's why kids don't understand that they're blocking the television. Here's another example. If a kid's looking at a picture and they say, "Oh, look at this," they're not going to turn the picture around to show it to you because they think you see it the same way they do. And so that's what we call egocentric thinking. Now, that is not the same as being egotistical. It just means the whole world, they don't understand that people have different aspects of how they're seeing the world. Two important concepts that are beginning to develop but are not fully developed in this stage. The most important one is probably conservation. So if you look here, this person is sitting in front of two containers. Both are the same size. Both have the same amount of liquid. If I pour the liquid into a different container and the kid's watching, they're watching me do it, they know it's the same amount. Because it looks higher, they don't understand that it is not more. They're going to say that this one has more liquid, even though they watched me pour the same amount in. So that's an idea of conservation, and it is not developed at this stage. It begins to develop, but it is not fully developed until the next stage. And then they also have something in this stage called animism, and this is where they give feelings and emotions to objects that are not alive. So things like a pet rock or a stuffed animal, those kind of things. And you'll see this if you ever babysit. You see kids doing this a lot. The third stage is called concrete operational. So now we have kids that are understanding conservation. So here you can see here's a test that you would do to test if kids have it. Okay, do these two lines have the same amount of dots? Yes or no? Do these two lines have the same amount of dots? And they have to answer it without counting them. If they don't have conservation as a concept, they will think that this one has more. They're able to actually reverse processes mentally. So, like if I make something out of Play Doh, mentally they can kind of think back to what the Play Doh looked like before. Their thinking is becoming less egocentric. They're starting to understand that, people have a relatively different view of the world than they do. And this stage is all at about 7 to 11 years of age. The last stage, oh, there's one more picture I think I have on here for you. This is another little test. Do each of these two cows have the same amount to eat? Obviously, they do. Well, how about in this second picture? You can see how a kid without the conservation concept would think that this cow probably has more grass, but they don't. It's actually the same amount. So that's that idea of conservation. In the last stage, we have the formal operational stage. This is about 12 years, so about puberty and up. Obviously, it's going to differ slightly depending on the child. In this one, operational thinking becomes a lot more conceptual. So they're no longer having to have, like, if I were going to explain fractions to a child, um, above this, at this stage, I would be able to explain just fractions. I wouldn't have to show them like pizza slices, like 3 out of 8 pizza slices. They're able to understand abstract thinking. They can have discussions that involve hypothetical questions. If you think about like this question right here, if I were to say like middle schoolers and younger, if I said to them, if you could live the next 24 hours and then erase everything and start over just once, what would you do? They would have a hard time answering that. And they would probably have a hard time understanding that people would have different answers. So lots of different outcomes are possible. That's a very mature development in children. Now, there are some criticisms of his theory. First of all, there were some studies that were done that show that not all people reach that last stage. I think this is a little bit conservative. It says there's a scientist named Dason in 1994 found that only about a third of adults reach that formal operational stage. I think that's pretty low. I think more than one third, but I could be wrong. Vygotsky, you're going to learn about Vygotsky in just a sec, but he did not believe, along with other developmental psychologists, that development occurred in stages, but rather it was a continual process. Um, if you think about development happening in stages, the idea that you can't rush the stage because it's based on biological development would have to be correct. Well, research has shown that if you spend a lot of time instructing children, they can actually move more quickly through these stages. And then finally, because this was universal, meaning these developmental stages are universal regardless of social and cultural settings, a lot of developmental psychologists had some issues with that because in different cultures, um, and also individual to individual, these things happen at different times. Last thing we're going to talk about is Lev Vygotsky. He's one of my favorites. He's really big in the educational field, and I think you'll see why in just a sec. In this case, children act as students or as interns, kind of like they're learning the process with mentors, right? So the social circle, their social and cultural environment are basically their teachers. Now, he had three zones of development, and the one that's most often talked about is called ZPD. That stands for zone. I don't know if I can type this. I don't think so. Zone of proximal, and I'll spell that out for you. Proximal, which means close, but not quite. Proximal development. So basically, if you look at this, the middle thing is what you can do on your own. Then you have this second zone, which is the ZPD or the zone of proximal development. That's what you can learn with help from others. Okay, so you're going to find those knowledgeable others that can help you. It could be your parents, it could be the internet, it could be your teachers, your friends. And then you have this other zone that is beyond that, that is outside of your reach, even with help. And this zone of proximal development is what teachers are working on, right? And so the way that you shrink that zone of proximal development is through something called scaffolding. And you've probably heard that, right? So you start small and you start building and building and building, and eventually you gain that knowledge. Language for Vygotsky was key. So understanding language and culture, all of those come together to build that cognitive development. I think that is it for this. I have a few quotes here for you that I would love for you to take a little bit of time and tell me which ones you think speak to you. There's a place on your guided notes for you to really quickly just pick which quote and tell me really briefly why you felt that quote really spoke to you. And that's it. Thanks, guys.